My 17-year-old hands trembled so violently, I nearly dropped the letter twice before I managed to read it completely. The words swam before my eyes, each sentence more devastating than the last, until I had to grip the edge of Isabella's vanity table to keep from collapsing onto her bedroom floor. My dearest Sarah, the Birmingham performance was flawless. Thompson suspects nothing. The forged medical records from our contact at the hospital have convinced him completely. Phase 3 can begin immediately, but we must be careful about the girl. She's been watching you more closely lately. Perhaps it's time to eliminate that particular obstacle before she becomes a real problem.
The letter fluttered from my numb fingers like a dying butterfly. For a moment, the world went completely silent. No birdsong from outside, no distant traffic from Main Street, no sound of my own ragged breathing. Then reality crashed back with the force of a freight train, and I was drowning in a mixture of rage and terror, so intense I thought my heart might burst. Isabella wasn't dying. She had never been sick. For 2 years, I had watched my father Daniel slowly crumble under the weight of believing his beloved wife was terminally ill, and it had all been a lie. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that final line about eliminating obstacles. She was talking about me. My name is Margaret Thompson, and I'm 73 years old now, but I'll never forget that moment when I was 17 and standing in the bedroom of a woman who had spent 7 years systematically destroying my family and was now planning to destroy me as well.
The sound of footsteps in the hallway made my blood freeze. She was coming back, and I was trapped in her bedroom with evidence that could get me killed.
To understand how I found myself reading that letter on March 18, 1968, I need to take you back to the beginning, to September 1951, when Isabella Montgomery first stepped off the Greyhound bus in Millbrook, Alabama, carrying a single suitcase and the most convincing sob story anyone in our small town had ever heard. I was 7 years old then, still raw from losing my mother Rachel in a car accident the previous winter. My father, Daniel Thompson, was 33, a skilled electrician who had built a comfortable life in our close-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business. Isabella claimed to be a 27-year-old war widow from Montgomery seeking a quiet place to heal from the devastating loss of her husband in Korea. She was beautiful in a way that made grown men stumble over their words. Auburn hair that caught sunlight like spun copper emerald eyes that seemed to hold depths of carefully displayed sadness, and a refined way of speaking that made all the church ladies whisper about her breeding. "There's something about that woman that don't sit right," declared Mrs. Josephine Fletcher, our sharp-eyed next-door neighbor, as she watched Isabella rent the apartment above Crawley's general store. "Mark my words, Margaret honey. A woman that beautiful don't end up in a place like Millbrook unless she's running from something." But my father saw only a grieving widow who needed protection and kindness. When Isabella mentioned needing electrical repairs in her apartment, he volunteered immediately, and I tagged along, as I always did, carrying his tools and trying to stay out of the way. What should have been a simple job, fixing a loose wire that any child could have tightened, turned into a 2-hour tutorial on electrical safety, with Isabella asking breathless questions and touching my father's arm whenever he explained something particularly technical. Even at 7, I sensed something artificial about her performance. The way she tilted her head when asking questions, the perfectly timed moments of vulnerability, the careful positioning that put her just close enough to seem interested, but not improper. It all felt rehearsed. But my father was completely enchanted. For the first time since my mother's death, he was humming as we walked home. The courtship that followed was masterful in its execution. Isabella never pushed or demanded anything. Instead, she created what seemed like natural opportunities for their relationship to deepen. She would happen to be struggling with groceries just as my father finished work. She would attend church services sitting alone with an expression of brave solitude that made him ache to comfort her. Within 6 months, she had accepted his proposal of marriage. Daniel and Isabella married in June 1952 in a ceremony the whole town attended. I was 8, wearing a yellow dress Isabella had chosen to complement the wedding theme. and trying to understand why the knot in my stomach kept growing tighter with each exchanged vow. The early years seemed normal enough from the outside. Isabella settled into the role of wife and stepmother with apparent grace. But certain patterns emerged that even as a child struck me as odd. There were the headaches, mysterious, debilitating attacks that seemed to strike whenever my father's attention wandered toward me or his old friends. "Daniel, darling," Isabella would whisper, pressing delicate fingers to her temples. "I feel one of my spells coming on." My father would immediately abandon whatever we were doing to tend to her needs, reading aloud, or simply holding her hand while she recovered in their darkened bedroom. Then there were the fears. Isabella developed an impressive collection of anxieties that required my father's constant protection. Thunderstorms terrified her. Being alone after dark gave her panic attacks. Strange sounds in the night sent her into trembling fits that could only be soothed by his presence. But what bothered me most was how she made me disappear. Not through cruelty. Isabella was never openly cruel. She simply had the gift of making conversations flow away from me, of timing her needs to coincide with moments when I might have had my father's attention. I learned to become invisible, to make no demands, to accept whatever scraps of attention remained after Isabella's needs were met. It was easier than competing with her theatrical displays. But I also learned to watch. And by the time I turned 12, I had begun to notice things that didn't add up. Like how Isabella's delicate constitution never prevented her from rearranging furniture when she thought no one was home. Like how her carefully cultivated helplessness disappeared entirely when she was haggling with shopkeepers over prices. Most disturbing were the letters. Every few weeks, Isabella would receive mail that she collected personally from the post office, always when my father was at work. These weren't ordinary correspondence. They were personal letters in expensive envelopes, written in masculine handwriting. I began following her, hiding behind storefronts and watching as she slipped old Mr. Hendricks what looked like folded bills in exchange for letters she would read immediately, then tear into pieces and scatter in different trash bins around town. By age 14, I had started keeping a journal hidden under my mattress documenting Isabella's suspicious behaviors. But I was just a kid with hunches and observations. I had no idea what I was really dealing with. The summer I turned 15 brought my first real attempt to expose Isabella, and my first devastating failure. I had finally worked up the courage to approach Mrs. Fletcher with my suspicions. She had always been kind to me, and she was one of the few people in town who had never been completely charmed by Isabella's performance. "Mrs. Fletcher," I said one afternoon when we were alone on her front porch, "I think there's something wrong with Isabella. I think she's been lying about things." Mrs. Fletcher set down her sweet tea and looked at me with concern. "What kind of things, honey?" I told her about the mysterious letters, the inconsistencies in Isabella's behavior, the way she seemed perfectly healthy when she thought no one was watching. I spoke quickly, desperately, pouring out 2 years' worth of observations and suspicions. When I finished, Mrs. Fletcher was quiet for a long moment. Then she sighed and patted my hand in a way that made my heart sink. "Oh, Margaret," she said gently. "I can see you're troubled by all this, but honey, what you're describing. It sounds like you might be jealous of your stepmother. That's natural for a girl your age, especially one who lost her mama so young. But Mrs. Fletcher, I'm not making this up. I've seen her when she thinks no one's looking, and she's completely different." "Now, sweetheart," Mrs. Fletcher interrupted, "Isabella has been nothing but kind to you and your daddy, and she's been so brave about her health problems. Sometimes, when we feel left out, we can convince ourselves that innocent things are suspicious." I stared at her, my cheeks burning with frustration and humiliation. Even Mrs. Fletcher, who had initially been skeptical of Isabella, had been won over by 7 years of perfect performance. "Promise me you won't go around town spreading stories about your stepmother," Mrs. Fletcher said firmly. "It would hurt her terribly, and it would embarrass your father. Isabella is a good woman dealing with difficult circumstances." I promised, because what else could I do? But that conversation taught me a crucial lesson. No one was going to believe me based on hunches and observations alone. If I was going to prove Isabella was lying, I needed concrete evidence. That's when I started taking real risks to uncover the truth. My breakthrough came in November 1965, when I made the dangerous decision to skip my piano lesson and hide in the coat closet to eavesdrop on one of Isabella's mysterious Tuesday afternoon phone calls. I had noticed that she always made these calls when my father was working at the Hendersons' farm, a job that kept him away for exactly 3 hours. This particular Tuesday, instead of walking to Mrs. Patterson's house for my lesson, I doubled back and slipped into our house through the kitchen door Isabella always left unlocked. My heart was pounding so loudly as I crouched in the narrow closet that I was sure she would hear it through the thin wall. At exactly 2:30 p.m., Isabella dialed a number she clearly had memorized. "Robert, it's me," she said, and her voice was completely different. Harder, more businesslike, stripped of the refined Southern accent she used with everyone else. "Thompson is completely under control. More than we even hoped." I pressed my ear to the wall, hardly daring to breathe. "The medical records you had Dr. Richmond forge are working perfectly," Isabella continued. "Daniel never questioned the Birmingham consultation. He believes every word about my delicate health." Forged medical records. My mind reeled as the implications hit me. "No, there haven't been any problems with the girl," Isabella said, and I realized with a chill that she was talking about me. "She's suspicious. I can see it in those sharp little eyes. But she's only 15. Who's going to believe a jealous teenager making accusations against her stepmother?" The conversation continued for another 10 minutes with Isabella discussing timelines and property deeds and something called Phase 3 that would happen in 1968. But I had heard enough to understand that everything I had suspected was true, and worse. Isabella Montgomery wasn't just manipulative. She was a criminal running an elaborate long-term con game, and my father was her target. When I crept out of the closet 20 minutes later, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely write in my journal. But this time, I had more than suspicions. I had concrete information about forged medical records and criminal conspiracy. The question was, what was I going to do about it? Over the following months, I began gathering evidence with the focus of someone whose life depended on it, which I was beginning to realize it might. I started timing Isabella's episodes and noting their suspicious correlation with my father's plans. I photographed her through windows when she thought she was alone, documenting her perfect health and energy. I even managed to copy down the phone number she called every Tuesday, though I had no way to trace it. But I also made mistakes. Lots of them. Once I got so focused on taking pictures that I forgot to watch for her return and barely managed to hide behind the garden shed. When she came out to collect laundry, I hadn't noticed hanging on the line. Another time, I tried to steam open one of her mysterious letters and accidentally tore the envelope, forcing me to throw it away and hope she wouldn't notice it was missing. I was learning the hard way that being a teenage detective was nothing like the Nancy Drew books I'd read. Real spying was terrifying, dangerous work that required skills I was making up as I went along. The breakthrough came in September 1966, when Isabella made a crucial error. She had received one of her secret letters, and in her excitement to read it, left it on the kitchen table while she went upstairs to use the bathroom. I had maybe 90 seconds to read and memorize as much as I could. "My dearest Sarah, not Isabella. Everything is proceeding according to plan. The Thompson mark is completely hooked. By Christmas 1967, you should have him ready to sign over the property deeds. The death certificates and new identities are ready whenever you need them. Just remember, no loose ends this time. We cannot afford another situation like the one in Valdosta." My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the paper, but I forced myself to memorize every word before carefully replacing the letter exactly where I'd found it. Sarah, not Isabella. Valdosta, wherever that was. Death certificates and new identities. And most chilling of all, no loose ends this time. I was no longer just dealing with a con artist. I was living with someone who had apparently done this before and who was planning to make sure there were no witnesses left behind to tell the story. In the summer of 1967, Isabella launched what I now recognize as the final phase of her deception. She began developing the serious illness that would justify her ultimate manipulations. It started with a persistent cough that seemed to appear from nowhere, followed by episodes of unexplained fatigue and mysterious pains that migrated throughout her body. My father, already trained by years of responding to Isabella's health complaints, immediately shifted into full caretaker mode. "I'm worried about Isabella," he confided to me one evening. "These new symptoms are different from her usual difficulties, more serious." I wanted desperately to tell him what I had discovered, but our previous conversations had made it clear he wasn't ready to hear the truth. Isabella's psychological hold on him was too strong. The trip to Birmingham in August 1967 sealed my father's fate. Isabella returned with a devastating diagnosis: aggressive lung cancer, advanced stage, 6 months to live. I watched my father age 10 years in 10 minutes as Isabella delivered this news with perfect theatrical timing. Her performance was flawless. Brave, but trembling, hopeful, but realistic, devastated, but determined to make the most of whatever time remained. But I noticed things my grief-stricken father missed. Isabella's color was too good for someone with advanced cancer. Her appetite remained strong, despite claims of nausea. Most tellingly, she had no medications, no follow-up appointments, no written medical instructions. When I asked to see the diagnosis papers, Isabella claimed they were too technical and frightening for someone my age. But I was no longer the naive child who had arrived in our family 16 years earlier. I was a 17-year-old with 2 years of detective experience and a growing understanding of just how dangerous my stepmother really was. That's when I made the decision that would either save my family or get me killed. I was going to search Isabella's room for evidence while she was supposedly dying in it. March the 18th, 1968. Isabella had gone to town for what she claimed was a final consultation with Doc Harrison about pain medication. My father was at work believing his wife was receiving medical care when she was actually meeting with her mysterious correspondent. I had maybe an hour to search her room before she returned. My hands were sweating as I carefully went through her vanity drawers, looking for anything that might prove her deception. In the third drawer, hidden beneath a stack of handkerchiefs, I found a small key that didn't match any lock I recognized in our house. It took me 20 minutes to discover that the key opened a compartment in Isabella's jewelry box, a secret space I never would have found without knowing to look for it. Inside were documents that made my blood run cold: multiple birth certificates with different names, a marriage license between Sarah Kellerman and Robert Ashford, dated 1959, correspondence with someone called Dr. Richmond about creating convincing medical forgeries, and most damning of all, a detailed timeline of their plan to steal my father's property and stage Isabella's death. But it was the letter dated March 16th, just 2 days earlier, that made me understand how much immediate danger I was in. "My dearest Sarah, Phase 3 must proceed exactly as planned. Thompson is emotionally prepared for your death and ready to sign over everything. But the girl has become too suspicious. She's been watching you too closely, asking too many questions. It's time to eliminate that obstacle permanently. Make it look like an accident, a fall down the stairs perhaps, or a drowning. Small towns accept teenage accidents more easily than teenage disappearances." The letter continued with specific instructions about staging my death and disposing of evidence, but I couldn't read anymore. My vision was blurring with terror and rage as the full scope of their plan became clear. Isabella wasn't just planning to steal from my father and disappear. She was planning to murder me first, to eliminate the only person who suspected the truth. The sound of a car in the driveway made my heart stop. She was back early. I stuffed the most important documents into my school bag, replaced everything else exactly as I'd found it, and barely made it out of her room before I heard her footsteps on the front porch. As I sat at the kitchen table pretending to do homework while Isabella chatted pleasantly about her medical appointment, I realized I was no longer just trying to save my father from a con artist. I was fighting for my life. That evening, as we sat around the dinner table like a normal family, Isabella began laying the groundwork for what I now knew would be her final performance. "Daniel, darling," she said, her voice carrying that familiar note of brave resignation. "Dr. Harrison thinks it might be time to make some practical arrangements. You know, for Margaret's future security." My father's face went gray. "Isabella, please don't talk like that. You're going to beat this thing." "Sweet man," Isabella said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "We both know that's not true, but I need to know that Margaret will be provided for when I'm gone. Perhaps we should speak to a lawyer about updating your will, making sure the house and property are properly arranged." I kept my eyes on my plate, forcing myself to eat, while my stepmother casually discussed the legal documents she would need to steal everything my father owned. "Of course," my father said immediately. "Whatever you think is best. I'll call Jim Patterson tomorrow about setting up an appointment." "Actually," Isabella said carefully, "I was thinking someone in Montgomery might be better. More discreet. This is such a personal matter, and you know how people in small towns talk." Even in my terror, I had to admire her skill. She was maneuvering my father toward lawyers outside our community, people who wouldn't know our family history or question unusual arrangements. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out my next move. I had evidence now, but who would believe such an incredible story? And more importantly, how much time did I have before Isabella decided I had become too dangerous to leave alive? The answer came sooner than I expected. 2 nights later, Isabella made her move. I was in my room supposedly sleeping when I heard voices from the master bedroom. The tone was different, more urgent, more intense than their usual conversations. I crept to my door and pressed my ear to the thin wall that separated our rooms. Daniel?" Isabella was saying, "I need to know that your love for me is absolute, that it's greater than everything else in your life." "Of course it is," my father replied immediately. "You know that, Isabella. I'd do anything for you." Would you really do anything?" There was something in her voice that made my blood run cold. A testing quality, as if she were building toward something monstrous. "I want you to prove it," she continued. "I want you to show me that you love me more than your own morality, more than society's rules, more than your own daughter." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my father's breathing change. "What do you mean?" he asked, and I could hear the growing dread in his voice. "I want you to be with Margaret." Isabella said the words, falling into the room like poison. "Here tonight, while I watch, I want to see you choose me over everything you've been taught is right and wrong." The sound my father made was barely human, a wounded animal cry that seemed to tear from his soul. I didn't wait to hear his response. I was already moving, grabbing the bag I had packed with evidence and emergency supplies. Because whether my father agreed to Isabella's demand or refused it, I knew our family was about to be destroyed forever. But as I climbed out my bedroom window, I heard something that gave me hope, my father's voice stronger than I'd heard it in months, saying 2 simple words that changed everything. "Absolutely not." I ran through the darkness toward the Fletcher's house, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Behind me, I could hear raised voices from our house. My father's anger and Isabella's increasingly shrill attempts at manipulation. Mrs. Fletcher answered my frantic knocking in her bathrobe, took one look at my face, and immediately pulled me inside. "Margaret, child, what in heaven's name?" "Mrs. Fletcher, I need your phone right now," I gasped. "Isabella isn't sick. She's been lying about everything, and she's trying to hurt my father, and she's planning to kill me." To her credit, Mrs. Fletcher didn't waste time with questions or demands for proof. She simply pointed toward her kitchen phone and said, "Make whatever calls you need, honey." My hands were shaking as I dialed Sheriff Williams' number, but somehow I managed to reach him at home. "Sheriff, this is Margaret Thompson. You need to come to my house right now. My stepmother has been running a con game on my father for 7 years, and I have evidence that she's planning to commit murder." "Margaret, slow down. Sheriff Williams said. What kind of evidence? Letters, documents, forged medical records, everything. She's not really Isabella Montgomery, she's Sarah Kellerman, and she's working with someone named Robert Ashford to steal my father's property. And they're planning to kill me because I figured it out. There was a pause, then Sheriff Williams' voice became sharp and professional. I'll be right there. Stay where you are and don't go back to that house. I also called Doc Harrison, knowing I would need medical expertise to back up my claims about Isabella's faked illness. Within minutes, I could see their headlights approaching. Now, Margaret, Sheriff Williams said as he settled into Mrs. Fletcher's parlor chair, I need you to show me everything you've found, and I need you to tell me exactly what's been happening. I laid out all the evidence I had gathered, the forged documents from Isabella's jewelry box, the photographs showing her perfect health, my detailed journal, documenting 2 years of suspicious behavior, and most damning of all, the letter discussing plans for my murder. Doc Harrison examined everything with the careful attention of a man who had spent 40 years in medicine. This is sophisticated work, he said grimly. These medical forgeries would fool most people. But Margaret's right. Isabella shows no signs of actually being ill. Sheriff Williams was already reaching for his radio. Deputy Morrison, I need backup at the Thompson house immediately. We have a fraud situation that may involve planned violence. As we prepared to confront Isabella, I felt a mixture of terror and relief. Finally, after years of watching her destroy my father, someone believed me. But I had no idea what we were about to walk into. We arrived at my house to find something I hadn't expected: my father standing on the front porch, looking shaken but determined. Margaret, he called when he saw me with the sheriff. Thank God you're safe. Isabella has been saying the most terrible things. Where is she now, Daniel? Sheriff Williams asked. Inside in the bedroom? She's very upset. She's been making wild accusations, saying Margaret has been spying on her, claiming you called the police to harass a dying woman. My father looked confused and exhausted. I don't understand what's happening, but when she wanted me to hurt Margaret, I told her to leave my daughter alone. We went inside together, Sheriff Williams and Deputy Morrison leading the way. The house felt different somehow, charged with tension and the electricity of secrets about to be exposed. We found Isabella in the master bedroom, but she was no longer maintaining her performance of terminal illness. She was fully dressed, pacing back and forth, her color healthy and her movements vigorous. When she saw us, her face went through a series of rapid calculations before settling on righteous indignation. Sheriff Williams, she said, her voice trembling with what appeared to be hurt and confusion. I cannot believe you would bring armed officers into the home of a dying woman based on the wild stories of a troubled teenager. Aye, ma'am, Sheriff Williams replied calmly. We have some questions about your medical condition and your identity. Would you mind showing us some identification and medical records? Isabella's performance was masterful. She pressed her hand to her chest as if the stress was overwhelming her fragile health. Of course, officer. Though I must say, this treatment is hardly appropriate for someone in my condition. She moved toward her vanity, and I watched in fascination as she opened drawers and searched through papers with increasingly frantic movements. I don't understand, she said finally. My medical records, my birth certificate, they seem to be missing. Margaret, darling, you wouldn't know anything about this, would you? All eyes turned to me, and I realized this was my moment. I pulled the documents from my school bag and laid them on the dresser. These records, Isabella, I said. The ones that show your real name is Sarah Kellerman, and you're married to Robert Ashford. The ones with letters discussing forged medical documents and plans to steal my father's property. For just a moment, Isabella's mask slipped completely, and I saw pure fury flash across her face. Then she composed herself and tried one last manipulation. Daniel, she said, turning to my father with tears in her eyes. Surely you don't believe this nonsense after 7 years of marriage, after everything we've been through together. My father looked at the documents in my hands, then at the woman he thought he had loved, and I saw the exact moment when the truth finally penetrated years of psychological conditioning. The cancer diagnosis, he said quietly. Show me the real medical records, Isabella, not copies, the originals from the hospital. Isabella's silence was answer enough. Ma'am, Sheriff Williams said, stepping forward with handcuffs, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and making terrorist threats against a minor. On what evidence? Isabella demanded, but her voice had changed completely, harder, sharper, stripped of all pretense. On the evidence your stepdaughter has been collecting, Deputy Morrison replied, gesturing to the documents spread across the dresser. Including correspondence with Robert Ashford detailing your criminal conspiracy and specific plans to commit murder. Isabella looked at me with something between hatred and grudging respect. You little bitch, she said, and now her voice carried no trace of the refined accent she had maintained for 7 years. You have no idea what you've cost me. I know exactly what I've done, I replied, surprised by my own steadiness. I've stopped you from destroying my father and murdering me. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Isabella seemed to make a decision. Perhaps it was the realization that her elaborate deception was finally over, or maybe it was spite, but she began to tell the truth, or at least a version of it. You want to know who I really am? She said, looking directly at my father. Fine. My name is Sarah Kellerman, and I'm very good at what I do. What I do is find lonely, desperate men and take everything they have. My father was staring at her as if he'd never seen her before. But why? Why spend 7 years on such an elaborate lie? Sarah laughed, and it was a sound like breaking glass. Because you made it so easy, Daniel. So pathetically easy. From the moment I stepped off that bus, I could see exactly what you needed. A helpless woman to protect a tragic figure to rescue. You practically begged to be manipulated. The illness? Doc Harrison asked. The cancer diagnosis? Theater, Sarah replied cheerfully. Beautiful, convincing theater performed by professionals who know their craft. Robert has connections throughout the medical community, people who'll play any role for the right price. She looked around the bedroom where she had performed her greatest deception. The plan was simple: make you fall in love with me, slowly take control of your finances, stage my tragic death, and disappear with everything you owned. Clean, efficient, profitable. And Margaret, Sheriff Williams asked grimly. Sarah's expression hardened. The girl was supposed to be manageable. Most children are so desperate for a mother figure, they'll believe anything. But this one? She shook her head. This one was watching me from day one, taking notes, gathering evidence. She became a liability that needed to be eliminated. The casual way she discussed planning my murder made my father physically recoil. You're sick, he whispered. No, Sarah replied. I'm practical, and I'm very, very good at reading people and giving them what they think they want. You wanted a woman to save, so I became a woman who needed saving. You wanted to feel like a hero, so I gave you opportunities for heroism. It's not my fault you were too stupid to see what was happening. As Sheriff Williams prepared to lead her away, Sarah turned to me one final time. I underestimated you, she said, and for the first time, there was genuine respect in her voice. That was my mistake. You're stronger than your pathetic father, smarter than I gave you credit for. In another life, I might have tried to recruit you instead of eliminating you. The compliment from someone so evil should have been meaningless, but somehow it felt like validation of everything I had endured to reach this moment. The investigation that followed Sarah's arrest revealed the true scope of her criminal enterprise and the shocking discovery that made everything even worse than I had imagined. FBI agents discovered that Sarah and Robert Ashford had been running their con game across 6 states for over a decade. But they hadn't been working alone. They were part of a larger network of con artists who specialized in targeting vulnerable widowed men in small southern towns. The most devastating revelation came when agents searched Robert's apartment in Montgomery and found detailed files on dozens of victims, including photographs, financial records, and psychological profiles that had been developed over months or years of surveillance. But it was the discovery in Robert's desk that hit closest to home, a manila folder labeled Thompson Millbrook that contained information going back to 1950, a full year before Sarah had arrived in our town. Inside were photographs of my father, copies of financial records, detailed notes about his personality and vulnerabilities, and most shocking of all, information about my mother's death that could only have been obtained through inside knowledge. Margaret Moyes, Sheriff Williams said when he came to give us this news, "I need to ask you something difficult. Is there anyone in town who's been particularly helpful to Isabella over the years? Anyone who might have had access to your family's personal information?" My father and I looked at each other, and I saw the same terrible suspicion forming in both our minds. "Mrs. Fletcher," I whispered. "She's always known everything that happens in our family. She's the one who convinced me I was just being jealous when I tried to tell her about Isabella's behavior." The investigation into Mrs. Josephine Fletcher revealed that she had been Sarah's inside source from the very beginning, providing detailed information about my father's financial situation, his emotional vulnerabilities, and his daily routines in exchange for monthly payments that had helped her supplement her meager widow's pension. Mrs. Fletcher, the woman I had run to for help, the neighbor who had seemed so kind, had been actively sabotaging my efforts to expose Sarah while feeding information to the people who were planning to rob and murder my family. She convinced me that my suspicions were just teenage jealousy, I told the FBI agents. Every time I got close to understanding what was happening, she made me doubt myself and feel guilty for not trusting Isabella. Mrs. Fletcher was arrested as an accessory to fraud and conspiracy. At her trial, she claimed she had never known about the plans to harm me physically, insisting she thought it was just a financial scam. But the evidence showed otherwise. Hidden in her house, agents found copies of letters discussing eliminating obstacles and ensuring no witnesses remained. She had known exactly what Sarah was planning, and she had helped make it possible. The betrayal by someone I had trusted, someone I had run to for protection, was almost as devastating as discovering Sarah's true nature. The trial of Sarah Kellerman. Robert Ashford and Josephine Fletcher began 8 months later and drew media attention from across the South. The prosecution painted a picture of a sophisticated criminal network that had perfected the art of psychological manipulation and financial fraud. These defendants, the prosecutor said in his opening statement, represent the worst kind of predators, those who weaponize human love and trust, turning our most noble emotions into tools of destruction. My testimony lasted 4 days. I presented the evidence I had gathered, described the manipulation techniques I had witnessed, and explained how Sarah had systematically isolated my father from anyone who might have questioned her deception. The defense tried to argue that Sarah's childhood of abuse had created psychological damage that made her actions understandable, if not excusable. They brought in expert witnesses who testified about cycles of trauma and how victims sometimes become victimizers. But when Sarah took the stand in her own defense, she destroyed any sympathy the jury might have felt for her. "I regret getting caught," she said when asked if she felt remorse for her actions. "I regret not being more careful about the girl. But I don't regret taking advantage of weak people. If you're stupid enough to be manipulated, you deserve what happens to you." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Sarah Kellerman was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Robert Ashford received 20 years as an accomplice. Mrs. Fletcher got 10 years for her role as an inside conspirator. The civil judgment ordered them to pay full restitution plus damages, nearly $125,000, representing not just the money stolen but compensation for years of psychological torture and the attempted murder conspiracy. But more important than legal justice was the beginning of healing for my father and me. The months following the trial were perhaps the most difficult of our lives. My father had to confront not only the reality of having been systematically deceived for 7 years, but also his own role in enabling that deception by refusing to listen to my warnings.
"I failed you, Margaret,"
he said one evening as we sat on the front porch swing he had installed after Sarah's arrest.
"I was so desperate to believe someone could love me again that I stopped protecting the person who mattered most. You were grieving Daddy," I replied.
Sarah was an expert at exploiting grief. She studied you like a scientist studies a specimen. We entered family counseling with Dr. Patricia Mills, a psychiatrist in Birmingham, who specialized in helping victims of psychological manipulation. The sessions were painful, but necessary, forcing us to examine how Sarah's influence had damaged our relationship and our ability to trust. What Sarah did, Dr. Mills explained, was a sophisticated form of emotional abuse designed to create psychological dependency. She identified your father's vulnerabilities and exploited them systematically, while simultaneously undermining any relationships that might threaten her control. My father had to learn to recognize the difference between love and obsession, between caring and controlling. He had to understand how his grief had made him vulnerable and how to build emotional defenses against future manipulation. I had to learn to trust again, to believe that not everyone who claimed to care about me had hidden motives. I also had to process the trauma of living for years with someone who had planned to murder me, and the additional betrayal of discovering that a trusted neighbor had been working against me. The healing process took years and wasn't linear. There were setbacks, arguments, moments when the damage seemed too extensive to repair. But we persevered, supported by counseling, by our genuine love for each other, and by our shared determination not to let Sarah's evil win. By 1971, we had established new patterns of communication and trust. My father began dating Patricia Reynolds, a widow from our church, whose own experience with loss had taught her the importance of patience and honesty in relationships. When they married in 1972, I gained not just a stepmother, but a true friend who understood that healing required time, consistency, and the willingness to rebuild trust one day at a time. In 1973, I received a letter that brought our story full circle. It was from the federal medical facility where Sarah was serving her sentence, and it contained a request that surprised me. She was dying of real cancer this time, and she wanted to see me before she died.
Margaret,
My father said when I showed him the letter.
you don't owe that woman anything. You've already given her more than she deserved by ensuring she faced justice instead of vigilante revenge.
But I felt a need for closure that I couldn't explain. Against my family's wishes, I made the trip to the medical facility where Sarah was spending her final weeks. She was genuinely dying this time. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Cancer had ravaged her body, leaving her gaunt and weak, but her eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made her so dangerous.
"Margaret,"
she said when I entered her room, "I wasn't sure you would come."
"I wasn't sure either," I replied. "But I needed to see you one last time."
We talked for 2 hours. Sarah told me about her childhood in detail, a level of psychological and physical abuse that explained, if not excused, her later behavior. But she also made it clear that she took full responsibility for her choices.
"I became a predator because it felt safer than being prey,"
she said.
"But that doesn't excuse what I did to people who trusted me, especially what I did to your family."
She looked at me directly, and for the first time, I saw something genuine in her expression. "You saved your father's life, Margaret. Not just his money or his property, his actual life. If I had succeeded in isolating him completely, destroying his relationship with you, taking everything he had worked for, he wouldn't have survived it. Men like your father don't recover from that level of betrayal and loss."
"Why did you ask me to come here?" I asked.
Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "Because you're the only person who ever beat me at my own game. You saw through every lie-gathered evidence I didn't think anyone was smart enough to find, and you never gave up, even when everyone told you that you were wrong." She reached for my hand with fingers that were barely more than skin and bone. "I want you to know that what you did, protecting someone you loved even when they wouldn't protect themselves, that's real strength.
That's something I never had and never understood until it was too late. I looked at this woman who had nearly destroyed everything I cared about, and I felt something I hadn't expected: pity. "I forgive you, Sarah," I said. "Not because what you did was forgivable, but because forgiveness is about freeing myself from carrying hatred." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion I had ever seen from her. "Thank you," she whispered. "That's more grace than I have any right to expect." 2 weeks later, Sarah Kellerman died alone in the prison medical facility. According to the chaplain, her final words were an apology to my father and a request that her story be used to help other families recognize and escape from similar manipulation. Sarah's death marked the true end of a chapter that had defined our lives for too long. In the years that followed my father, Patricia and I built something beautiful from the ruins of what Sarah had tried to destroy. I graduated from high school in 1969 and attended Auburn University, where I studied psychology with a focus on understanding manipulation and recovery from emotional abuse. My experience gave me insights that proved invaluable in helping other victims recognize and escape from similar situations. I married James Mitchell in 1974, a relationship that developed slowly and carefully, built on honesty and mutual respect, rather than desperate need or romantic obsession. We had 3 children who grew up understanding the importance of healthy relationships and the ability to recognize manipulation. My father lived to be 82, passing away peacefully in 2003, surrounded by family that genuinely loved him. Patricia remained a constant source of strength until her death in 2008. Together, they showed me what real love looked like: supportive rather than controlling, strengthening rather than diminishing, built on trust rather than manipulation. For the past 30 years, I have worked as a counselor, specializing in helping victims of psychological abuse. I share our story not for sympathy, but for education, so that others might recognize the warning signs before it's too late. The techniques Sarah used are still being employed by predators today: isolation from support systems, manufactured crises that create dependency, intermittent reinforcement that creates addiction to approval, and gaslighting that makes victims doubt their own perceptions. But these techniques can be recognized and defeated. Education is the most powerful weapon against manipulation, and people who understand how psychological abuse works are much less likely to become victims. I am 73 years old now, the same age my father was when he passed away. I've lived long enough to see my children build strong families, to watch my grandchildren grow up with healthy understanding of love and relationships. The scars from those years with Sarah never completely disappeared, but they became sources of strength rather than shame. They taught me to value consistency over charm, honesty over grand gestures, respect over passion. If you're reading this story and recognizing patterns from your own life, please know that you're not alone. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't let anyone convince you that seeking help is a betrayal of love. Real love builds up rather than tears down. It creates strength rather than weakness. It encourages independence rather than dependency. And it never, ever requires you to sacrifice your safety, your relationships with others, or your moral compass. The National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-799-SAFE, provides 24/7 support for people experiencing emotional abuse. Help is available and healing is possible. Our story began with deception and nearly ended in murder. But it ultimately became a story of recognition, courage, and the triumph of truth over lies. That transformation is available to anyone willing to seek help and do the difficult work of healing. Love should never hurt. Trust should never be weaponized. And no one should have to face manipulation and abuse alone.